Perhaps we roll forward and we'll pull Chris in when he joins us.
Good. It sounded like Tamara was taken over by aliens. John, do you want to start this then?
Sure, happy to do so. My name is Sean Egan. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which, if you're not familiar with that, it is the partnership between the ports of Tacoma and Seattle for the combined management of our marine cargo operations. We are the fourth largest load center in North America for containerized cargo. In addition to that, we also handle a variety of other types of cargo, including break bulk cargo, which is odd-shaped cargo that you can't fit into a container. Think about things like John Deere tractors or combines, caterpillars, mining equipment, farming equipment, things like that. We also handle a variety of automobile imports as well as grain exports. And while all of that is certainly interesting, what makes this most important is the economic development that comes out of handling that marine cargo. That marine cargo through the gateway supports an estimated 58,400 jobs, and we generate over $250 million in state tax revenues every biennium. So in the case of COVID, we, like everyone else in Washington State, got the go-home order on March 13th. Half of our staff has been working remotely since that point in time, primarily the administration staff, so folks like myself, our environmental department, engineers, finance, etc. And what's been remarkable is how well we've been continuing to operate. Our maintenance crews and security remain in the office, continuing to do really good work, and both the terminal operators and our longshore partners are also at work. Within the first few days, we were able to develop new safety protocols for the entire West Coast that were agreed on by labor, by terminal operators, and by ports. And because of that, we have, in the Pacific Northwest, been able to avoid an infection on the marine terminals up until last Friday. That was the first time we've actually had an infection. And in those particular cases, we're able to quickly shut down the specific facilities where they were at, clean them, and get them reopened within a period of 24 hours. So in many aspects, it's really been remarkable how well the ports have continued to be able to function. And it's critical that they do so because we handle a variety of emergency equipment and emergency goods that are needed for this pandemic, as well as essential supplies. This is relevant not only in terms of the international cargo we handle, but also domestic cargo. We are the primary gateway to the state of Alaska. 90% of everything consumed in the state of Alaska comes through either the ports of Tacoma or Seattle. We are also a major load center for the state of Hawaii as well. And we know that when the pandemic hit and they were rushing to their grocery stores for toilet paper and diapers and milk and everything else that we were looking for here locally, they were looking to us to make sure that the marine terminals were open so that we could continue to restock grocery store shelves in Anchorage and Fairbanks and the other communities to the north. With that said, we certainly have been impacted by COVID, particularly when it comes to our cargo volumes. And the slide that you see before you gives a sense of that. We are about to release our June container volumes. Those are going to be released this Friday, so we'll have fresher numbers. But for the month of May, you see that we were down 24% year over year. And overall, our containers are down 19% year to date. And one of the things I need to emphasize is this is compared to 2019, which was not a particularly good year for us in the Pacific Northwest. 2019, we saw a downturn in our cargo volumes due in large part to the trade war with China and many of the tariffs that are in place. So when you see these numbers that are going down, I think it's important to remember that these are maybe masking that things are in fact worse than where we should be compared to several years ago. Not only have we seen our containers go down, our auto volumes are down as well by 22%. Break bulk is the one bit of good news. It's only off a few points. But overall, we are seeing the cargo volumes coming down. That has resulted in something known as void sailings. A void sailing is when a ship that is scheduled to arrive simply doesn't show up. Think about our international trade routes as being a lot like a bus route. You have a giant circle around the Pacific Ocean called a string, and the ocean carriers will put enough vessels in that string to be able to have a regular call at a port, let's say once a week, every other week, something like that. Just like, again, you would have on a bus route where you would hope to have the bus show up at your bus stop every 15, 20, 30 minutes, what have you. When the cargo volumes have come down, the ocean carriers have begun to pull ships out of those service strings so that you eventually get a service skip. So instead of getting a vessel every Wednesday, maybe every third Wednesday, all of a sudden there is no vessel that is there. To give you a sense of context, 2018 was a little high, but a sort of normal year. We had 38 voids occur during that year. Last year, we had 59. And again, that was a record year for us because of the trade wars associated with China. So last year was a really bad year. This year, as of midpoint of this year, we've already hit 62 blank sailings. So there is a very strong likelihood that we may end up doubling our record numbers in terms of void sailings. Now, that has some consequences. Part of it, obviously, is a lack of business opportunity for us in the Pacific Northwest. Part of it is a lack of employment opportunities, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what's interesting is because of the lack of business coming by ship to our marine terminals, the terminal operators have been responding by periodically closing their terminal gates. And this is particularly true, this is true for all of our terminals, but one of them I just call out by way of example is terminals 18 and 20 up in our Seattle harbor operated by SSA Marine. They have for some time now been closed every single Friday. And it's just a way for them to be able to better conserve their costs in light of the fact that we've got a lack of cargo coming through the gateway. That has implications, however, for our surface transportation network, and I'm sure Sherry will be able to elaborate on this when she speaks. One of the things that we are finding is that while the terminals might be closed on a Friday, that doesn't necessarily mean that the warehouses are closed. It doesn't mean that the factories or farms are closed. And so as a result, truck traffic is still being generated. So a lot of times what you're going to see usually come Monday morning is pretty long backups at the gate because there's all this pent-up demand that is then trying to flow through. After a couple days, though, that tends to dissipate, and then all of a sudden, by the end of the week, you could be able to shoot a cannon through some of these terminals. So it's a lot of sort of feast and famine that we are attempting to manage in partnership with our terminal operators, in partnership with the trucking community. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. The cargo volumes are interesting. What's more important, again, is the women and men who handle the cargo. And that is certainly true whether you're talking about longshore workers. This is true about truck drivers, people working at the railroad, warehouse distribution, what have you, because that's, again, why we do what we do. It's to be able to create those employment opportunities. What this chart shows you is longshore hours in Tacoma and Seattle year over year by week. And so if you look on the left-hand chart, you basically see where we were at a year ago in 2019, and you see that once we began to get into 2020, those numbers have gone down, basically gone down the drain there. Over the last several weeks, you are going to see that our longshore hours are down anywhere between 30 to 43%. Now, one caveat I want to make sure to note is that these longshore hours for Tacoma and Seattle capture not only marine cargo, but it also captures the cruise business. The cruise business is not operated by the Seaport Alliance. That remains something under the control of the Port of Seattle, but the data is all reported together. So I just want to make that caveat. If you took cruise out, you're probably looking at about I would guess about a 25% reduction in hours. The upshot, though, on all of this is the numbers are grim. The employment is down, and we've got a lot of work to do to be able to recapture cargo, recapture jobs, and ultimately be able to recapture market share. So those were the couple things I wanted to make sure to share. If Chris is available, I would love to turn that back over to him. Otherwise, let my colleagues talk, and I'd be happy to answer questions if you would like at the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you. Chris is available, and his video isn't working, so we will listen to the ghost version. Chris?
Can you hear me, Commissioner?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Excellent, very good. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Chris Herman. I'm the Senior Director for Trade and Transportation with the Washington Public Ports Association. We represent Sean and both the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, as well as the 73 other port districts across the state of Washington. I am pleased to be here today, and I'll jump right into it. Really what I'm intending to do here is to give you sort of a statewide snapshot on what we're looking at from a ports perspective to the impacts of COVID. Sean did a great job of telling you specifically what's going on in Seattle and Tacoma with the Northwest Seaport Alliance. I'm going to touch base on a couple of ports. I'm going to take you through a quick snapshot of a couple of the key commodities that are important to Washington State's economy, and then leave you with a sort of few last thoughts. So I kind of have three, as I went through my members soliciting information, I have kind of three takeaways that seem to be prevalent across the board. COVID is exacerbating tariff impacts to trade and supply chains that are important to Washington. That's become pretty clear, and I'll give you a few examples. Impacts appear at this point to be predominantly situational and short term, but yet very fluid. And so that really, I think, suggests what kind of a rebound do we see as far as what those impacts look like longer term. And then for ports across the state being essential, many of the infrastructure projects that we were doing continue to occur. Construction continues to happen. There are a few elements across Port World where construction has been paused or projects have been delayed, but as a general rule, many of those projects move forward, and those that have gone out to bid have been coming in under budget. So one particular example of COVID's impact, and this is almost a counter to Sean's presentation. So at the Port of Vancouver, the grain terminal in the end of June had 2 positive COVID cases. And what that resulted in was United Grain shutting down for 36 hours to clean their facilities and be able to safely reopen for operations. What transpired, however, led to 20 longshore persons ultimately having to be quarantined, and that has now resulted in a shortage of labor to unload vessels that are inbound to the port. So the good news is that the systems that we put in place to safely reopen are working. The problem is the productivity of when an incident occurs is significant and it will last into potentially weeks and maybe even months after the incident. So the good news there is we can say that only there was one longshore person that did end up testing positive for COVID, and all of the 20 or so other shift workers that were quarantined are back to work as of last Friday. So just sort of an anecdotal analysis there. So reaction to COVID was fast, and in some cases, with regard to supply chains, too fast. Again, Port of Vancouver is the primary distribution point for imported Subaru vehicles on the West Coast. At one point, deliveries to dealerships across the U.S. and across particularly the West Coast ceased, but the Subarus kept coming from Japan. And so similar to what we find, we as ports need to be nimble and be able to locate and find storage space for those vehicles as they come in. I wanted to, before I jump into some of the commodity piece, give you a little bit of a snapshot of air travel. It's not on this panel here related to freight, but I did want to touch base because I think it's relevant certainly to what we've seen as society continues and the pandemic pushes us more towards purchasing things online and receiving them at our doorsteps. So SeaTac released data yesterday. They are about 75% off year to date in enplanements or folks traveling through the security checkpoints. It's about 16,500 passengers per day. Let's see, I have numbers here. So domestic travel is down about 86%. International travel is down 97% year to date. Aircraft operations are down 50%. So that means there's an uptick in freighter volume at SeaTac. But predominantly what that means is planes aren't nearly as full as you and I remember them to be. If you feel safe, it's probably a time to get out and travel because you will be a little bit more comfortable in the airplane, although you may be a little more concerned. Switching to the air cargo side, obviously the trends have been upwards for many years. In 2019, SeaTac saw air cargo volumes up 5.8% to just under 400 million metric tons, or excuse me, 400 million metric tons. So for this year, what we've seen is domestic cargo is actually doing quite well. It's up 14% year over year as we see more things shift to really needing to be delivered yesterday as we address issues related to PPE or food supply. But the international cargo is down about 50% out of SeaTac, and that, of course, much of that moves in the belly of those international airplanes, where again 97% of that passenger traffic is down. So year to date, air cargo is down about 1%. So a few industries that are impacted, and many of these are directly affiliated with port districts. Wanted to touch a little bit on the commercial fishing industry. Westport, Washington is the 11th largest seafood producing region. About 150 million pounds of crab, salmon, and hake in 2017. Commercial fishing is increasingly and very much reliant on international markets. Again, without those planes traveling internationally and certainly other countries dealing with COVID as well, there's been a significant impact to that industry, and it's been hit very, very hard. A bright spot is that the CARES Act has provided $50 million to Washington State, specifically earmarked towards the commercial seafood industry. Of note, I said Westport's number 11. Dutch Harbor, Alaska is number 1. And to show another impact, much of that is shipped by air into Washington State for processing. So that has a secondary impact to our state's economy as well. We've been learning a lot about how we consume food. So number 2 on my list is potatoes. 95% of potatoes are consumed at either restaurants or schools. What's been shut down so far over the last 3 months? Restaurants and schools. I think many of us have seen the giveaways of potatoes across particularly eastern and central Washington. There's been about £1 million or £1 billion of excess potatoes in storage. And again, potatoes have been an increasing part of the state's export program over the last many years. We've seen double-digit growth in the last couple of years. And as Sean's alluded to, the Northwest Seaport Alliance is the #1 gateway for frozen and refrigerated product in the U.S., and that is largely in the back of potatoes. I wanted to end on a high note here. Asparagus is doing really, really well. We've been consuming a lot of asparagus, and we've been paying more money for it as well. And again, this is an air cargo story where we haven't had imports, cheap imports, coming into the U.S. as readily, making the market much better. We're actually the #1 producer of asparagus in the U.S. It's a $45 million industry. About 23 million pounds are produced. I do want to touch base on one other item that I think is of interest before I wrap up, and that is on the rail side. So specifically for Eastern Washington and their ability to move produce out of the state of Washington. One facility that has had a lot of public and private support over the years, often known as the RailX facility in Walla Walla County. That facility was purchased 3 years ago by the Union Pacific Railroad, and they branded that as Cold Connect. It's really a distribution. Again, it's here in Washington State. It collects produce from across central and eastern Washington and ships that in a 5-day train over to New York State, where it is then shipped to distribution points. Union Pacific closed that facility in early June, and I wanted to report that the Port of Walla Walla, while it does not own the facility continues to be on port property, and the port does own some of the infrastructure associated with it. They are in talks with Union Pacific about repurposing that facility, and we hope that we'll be able to see that put back into use. This one of the notes that Union Pacific advised during their the press release about closing the facility is that the trucking competition to East Coast is been increasingly fierce, and they note that truck rates have decreased up to 50% in that space here during COVID. So it's a tough market, certainly, and again, one that continues to evolve. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to hold questions till we get through all the panelists, if that's all right with you. So next we have, excuse me, Johan Hellman. Yeah, got that right. So
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Johan Hellman. I'm the Executive Director of Public Affairs for the BNSF Railway here in the Pacific Northwest. The title keeps changing, but the name remains the same. So as long as I keep representing the company, I suppose I'm happy with all of that. But it's an honor to speak with you again this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to serve on this panel as well with my colleagues from trucking industries, ports, shipping. It seems like it's been a little too long since we've all got together again, so it's great to see your faces. For my comments, I'm going to focus on 3 areas. First, how railroads responded following the outbreak of COVID-19. Second, what we learned from this experience. And then third, what we see going forward. And as I pondered these issues in the last few days, one word comes to mind, and that word is resilience. That word resilience will be an ongoing theme throughout my comments. In our past conversations together, one of the facts I've always pointed out is that railroad service is usually one of the first services to come back online following a natural disaster, following earthquakes or floods. Freight rail is usually among the first services restored and often plays a critical role in delivering building products and medicines and other critical supplies as economies are reestablished and communities get back on track. And that proved out again with COVID-19. BNSF and other railroads were designated as critical infrastructure, providing essential services at both the federal and state levels when the first stay-at-home orders were issued this last spring. We quickly established our own internal supply chains for sourcing cleaning materials, hand sanitizers, and other products to keep our critical employees safe. We immediately adopted the Center for Disease Control's recommendations for workplace hygiene and industrial safety. For example, we were early leaders in providing workers with facial coverings and adopting protocols for cleaning and sanitizing equipment. Our quick action allowed us to not only keep the supply chain moving, but to do so with the highest level of safety for our employees, our customers, and the hundreds of communities that we serve. One of the benefits of the supply chain is its inherent flexibility. And this has proved out in the past few months as supply lines shifted from brick and mortar retail to online services. We were able to adapt with very little disruption. In fact, in many ways, our network is operating as well or even better today than it ever has, at least in the recent past. Most folks don't realize that when they purchase something online and then track it across the country on their phones or their laptop computers from Chicago to Kansas City and then out to the West Coast, most of the time that item is moving on a freight train. Even though we adapted well and we retooled effectively, we're nevertheless concerned about lingering volatility in the economy. Rail volumes are down significantly, well into the double digits, and the economy is facing serious headwinds with high unemployment, supply chain disruptions, and with changing demand for agricultural items, consumer goods, building products, durable goods, and many other commodities. And like most companies, America's freight railroads, BNSF included, are experiencing furloughs and layoffs, restructuring departments, amending capital plans, and right-sizing to the current economy. It is indeed a challenging time, and freight railroads are weathering many of the painful realities of the current economic recession, along with many other companies and many individual families, quite frankly, in numerous sectors. What we've learned from COVID-19 is that transportation and the industrial sectors are the resiliency in our communities and in our economy. Few people foresaw the current pandemic or really understood the impacts it could have on our daily lives. But when distilleries needed to be converted to make hand sanitizer and clothing companies needed to convert to making medical masks, and distribution hubs switched from serving retail storefronts to serving hospitals, community centers, and individual homes directly, these changes occurred at industrial centers and local communities throughout our state. And as the commercial and residential sectors continue to weather unprecedented changes, those cornerstone Washington state industries of agriculture, manufacturing, natural resources, trade, and transportation will continue to serve as the state's economic backbone. Now, mind you, we are all affected. Some of us are affected quite dramatically, but these are the industries powering us through the downturn as they have for more than a century. And all this activity is built on a solid foundation of transportation infrastructure. Which brings me to my third point, the road ahead. As I said, transportation and industry are the resiliency in our communities and in our economy. And as society's focus has shifted to critical services and essential industries, it has also exposed some potential weaknesses in our collective infrastructure. For example, I can think of at least 3 bridges in the greater Seattle area alone that are in imminent need of repair or even replacement. And these are bridges that we hear about, some of them on a daily basis, but some of them are just smaller bridges in local communities that serve a very important purpose. As I look out at communities across the state, I see opportunities to invest in last mile connectors and grade separations, places where we can reroute intermodal traffic to lessen its impact on residential neighborhoods, and many, many other projects around the state, which have the potential to deliver a triple bottom line benefit of, number one, putting people back to work with good paying construction jobs. Number two, spurring investment that reverberates through our communities. For example, every dollar spent on rail infrastructure delivers $8 in economic activity in return. And I know that investments in freight corridors and port facilities yield similar returns on investment. And third, these investments position Washington, the most trade-dependent state in the nation, for future trade prosperity by upgrading our critical transportation infrastructure and repositioning our freight handling infrastructure as world-class and state-of-the-art. Right now, we have a unique opportunity, maybe a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, to build on our strengths and position our state for future prosperity by building our way out of the current recession. And in that spirit, I look forward to working with you as we power through the current pandemic, the accompanying economic malaise, and into hopefully a new era of transportation excellence and prosperity. I thank you for time this afternoon. I look forward to the discussion, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Johan. Interesting. I think that's going to generate a couple of questions when we get complete here. Our next presenter is Sherry Call, Executive Vice President, Washington Trucking Associations. And I learned why it's plural. So you might want to explain that to others.
Good, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman Litt, members of the Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Washington Trucking Associations is actually kind of a conglomerate of several smaller associations that represent all segments of the trucking industry. We're actually made up of 7 different industry segments. We are fully member supported through dues, and that's our primary job, is to represent the industry in Washington. Of course, those segments include common for-hire carriers, private carriers, dump truck, log truck, household good movers, and intermodal carriers, as well as allied suppliers to the industry. We're affiliated nationally with the American Trucking Association and their research wing, the American Transportation Research Institute. So a lot of our data today is really coming from just the data collection process that we've been going through for the past several months. That really, it seems like it all started for me on March 13th, the day after legislative session. So we're all having the worst interim, I think, of our entire lives, I hope. But we do several member check-ins, over 500 member companies in all segments that we're checking in with on a regular basis at various points. Throughout this crisis. We have twice weekly economic reports from American Trucking Association economist Bob Costello, which has been a valuable resource. And then a recent study by ATRI and in combination with OIDA, the Independent Drivers Owner Operators Association impact survey on the COVID crisis, in which they received over 5,000 responses. So just starting out, trucking is dependent on freight volumes, as you all know, as many other modes of transportation are, and freight has been volatile by sector during this crisis. We saw sharp declines in freight in the months of March and April, followed by rebounds in May in some sectors. Some of the sectors that we are tracking and some that have been doing worse than others include, as Sean mentioned and Chris mentioned, both in the import-export freight via port world. We've seen a huge decline in activity there and a strange impact on freight patterns. We obviously, with the earlier impact of the Chinese outbreak, we actually experienced lower freight volumes normally at the beginning of the year, but this was, preceded by the tariff impact and all of that. And then, of course, as Chris mentioned, I had to correct my notes here because I thought a billion pounds couldn't be right. It has to be a million, but a billion pounds of potatoes sitting in warehouses that are available for donation. Many of our members have been hauling volunteer loads of those potatoes around the state. And then, of course, agricultural goods, as you've seen in popular media, that we're unable to process, including meat and milk. Obviously, manufactured goods have done poorly. There were initial declines in factory output that have been impactful to Washington. Partly to blame is supply chain issues, mainly because of the port import-exports that hadn't been coming in. And then a decline just in general due to layoffs, several companies that had to reduce their workforce in order to adjust. Obviously, in brick and mortar retail, we've seen a huge reduction in retail goods and in building materials for both home and commercial construction. So our members report in some time frames over a 4-week period before a truck even turned a wheel, during the time when construction was stopped. So we had impact to flatbed carriers, we had impact to specialized carriers, and less than truckload carriers as well reported some problems. So it was a big move. When the governor allowed construction to resume, that was a really big deal for the trucking industry, and allowed us to begin what we thought was the beginning of our recovery anyway in this process. An exception to some of the worst or just building materials was the logging industry. Our log truckers have been busy throughout this pandemic crisis. Although they feared shutdown of mills or oversupply was a concern, and I think that might have been alleviated since the construction industries have started back up again. Obviously, hazmat haulers with, I believe, DOT reporting decline in traffic on the freeways of up to 40%, fuel distribution and air travel being down caused a short-term, at least, delay in hauling our hazmat goods. And then the service industry, obviously, supplies to restaurant and hospitality organizations. What we saw and have seen do better is online retail. In fact, some people theorize that this is a Amazon crisis that may have been created so that they could increase online sales. Doubtful, but it's fun to have, fun to theorize, as we've all known. And then obviously doing better is the grocery industry, which surged with both panic buying and hoarding that was going on in both dry and refrigerated goods, medical supplies, but eventually leveled off. Overall, in the scheme of things, according to an ATRI and OIDA survey, the estimates are about 1 in 4 companies have been unaffected by the pandemic. We attribute this to consumers really keeping trucking afloat, building and buying homes, buying groceries, and online retail, basically. We're seeing smaller fleets having the greatest reduction in freight. Larger fleets are reporting about the same freight levels. This means that small fleets are basically more negatively impacted by this crisis. And in terms of establishing a new normal, I believe that this is a day-to-day process and it's still ongoing. Obviously, the virus has yet to peak, and we don't know if it's going to continue to get worse or if it will continue to improve. And estimates for return of freight volumes, as you have probably noticed, that we have what their economists are considering as a W-shaped recovery, where we will see some ups and downs, and I think that has a lot to do with the uncertainty surrounding the virus conditions. Just a bit about help for companies, not just trucking, but across the board during the pandemic. We've seen a lot of regulatory relief. It's been a very positive response with the collaboration between state and federal government entities and industry on getting our relief in place right away so that there was certainty around trucking operations right to begin with. So we didn't have a huge, freight volumes were really the issue. It wasn't our ability to move. So we have been operating under limited hours of service waivers. We have extension of expiring credentials in many cases. Personally, we received from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the federal government, 100,000 masks in the state of Washington directed toward truck and other drivers. And WTA has been responsible for distributing about 10,000 of those masks. We're still in the process of since the supply that came to Washington has been redistributed, we're a recipient of about 7,000 more masks, so we're going to be working on getting those out. And then, of course, the disaster relief and PPP loans have allowed us to keep our valuable workforce in many cases. Trucking tends to be a high margin, low margin, cash flow dependent business industry that is dependent on the churn of day-to-day business activity. So our concern where crossroads meet of PPP monies running out and freight volumes not reestablishing normal volumes is the crossroads of business failures. And so that's something that the industry has its eye on right now, is the potential for failures to happen. There's been a trend in the industry of fleets shedding equipment. This is helping with, obviously capacity reduction, reduces equipment costs, and allows companies to adjust to uncertainty in freight levels. And I think that might have something to do with what I believe Sean mentioned earlier about freight rates going up by truck because of capacity reduction. I'm sure there's other factors associated with that. A little bit about what drivers have experienced or are experiencing out there on the roads. I like to, as often as possible, give a shout out to our Washington State DOT on keeping rest areas open and sanitized. One of the first, I think, lines of communication for me was when it hit the media that rest stops were closing, that parking facilities for trucks were closing. I think there was a 2-day period in Pennsylvania where everything was shut down, and trucks who were critical and essential in this whole crisis were essentially left without services to continue doing their work. So that kind of got the attention of everybody nationwide, but I can guarantee you we didn't have those issues here in the state of Washington, and WSDOT has been very proactive about their communications with us on that. Way station facilities are being utilized, obviously, for overnight parking. One of the things that we've been getting fielding is complaint calls from local drivers, local and over-the-road drivers, who have concerns with staying healthy while they're on the road, in light of the lack of sanitary facilities at way stations. So no hand washing, no flushing toilets, and we're a little bit concerned about how we deal with that going forward, especially if we're continuing to deal with truck parking issues in Washington. So, and then according to the ATRI and OIDA survey, drivers are experiencing shorter hauls. We're not entirely clear why, but many are attributing this to a decrease in long haul movement of international freight and fleets recalibrating to move essential consumer goods from local and regional warehouses to retail locations. And also faster travel times, which has been, absolutely one of the positives in this. I think we may be back up to regular traffic volumes, but for a period of time, we had zero traffic congestion. It seemed that all we had on the roads were trucks. And according to ATRI's bottleneck survey, which tracks GPS data for trucks nationwide, bottlenecks just disappeared. We had zero bottlenecks nationwide in every location that they track for a period of a few months. So that was a nice thing for us. Going forward, COVID conditions and post-pandemic issues to watch. I've mentioned truck parking, and I can't say enough about this being a perennial concern for trucking. We need to keep truck stops, rest areas, and way station parking open and clean for drivers. And we need to find ways to expand availability of parking in Washington, both COVID and non-COVID periods. We're keeping our eye on business model changes post-pandemic. Will companies continue to adopt telecommute options? I know us personally, we're negotiating with our few staff to keep work from home options, and several of our members have said that this pandemic condition has led them kicking and screaming into the 21st century, but at the same time, working from home is something that they've always considered, but have never gotten off the dime to do. So I think now that we're here, we see that we can do it, and maybe some of our old school bosses can get their minds around us working from home. So, and then just industry preparedness. We've seen overnight how things can change, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and I think I've heard it mentioned several times that this is not the crisis that we were expecting and what we've been prepared for. So we're focused on our member companies and how they might be preparing for a future disaster. for business continuity and likewise. And then one of the major things that not just developing, but that will be ongoing for a while is just changes in the way consumers are buying, which is forcing the issue for our industry on contactless delivery protocols in order to balance the needs of customers and maintaining driver health. The Consumer Brands Association has established a task force made up of manufacturers, retailers, and supply chain partners to come up with standards for moving freight from Class 8 vehicles to last mile drop-offs and points in between, utilizing contactless protocols. And then, of course, local delivery companies, in the scheme of essentiality from day one, have already implemented protocols out of necessity to keep drivers and the public safe. There might be some issues to be considered in terms of signature required type items and how we address those going forward. But that's about all I have for today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you. I guess I'll leave the questions off, and this could be for anybody, but Johan's the one that sparked the question. When we're talking about well, first I should say, the Commission's always been very strong in supporting freight mobility and doing what we can. Coming from Eastern Washington, you know, I have to associate most of what I see from the area I'm in, which is a big mover of grain. So what changes do you think the pandemic may have triggered that we need to look forward to and think of and incorporate into what we do as policymakers?
Well, since I sparked the question, I'll go ahead and be the first to take a run at it. I think in some ways, just our daily lives are fundamentally different and may never go back to normal the way that they were before. As Sherry mentioned, people are telecommuting. You know, this was a promise that we've all sort of been aware of for the last 10 or 15 years, and all of a sudden, it's all of our daily experience, you know. I can now drive from Olympia to Seattle in less than 60 minutes. I can't recall being able to do that since like 1983, right? And who knows what percentage of that traffic might never come back again. But while things have changed dramatically, in some ways a lot of other things haven't, right? Trade still happens on the backs of trains and trucks and ships, and to a certain degree airplanes, and grain still moves in rail cars and barges, and that infrastructure, those fundamental backbone pieces of our trade sector, that remains the same. And so, you know, as we think about policy, really everything, as I see it, is on the table right now. You know, I mentioned the whole idea of this is the time to invest in infrastructure and trade infrastructure. Many of us serve on the FMCIB board or have served on the FMCIB board. We belong to coalitions like the Great Northern Corridor Coalition. These are things that we've talked about for a long time. I feel like the path forward, this is really the moment to seize on those opportunities and really explore how is it that we fund these things. There have been a number of different ideas that have been put out in the past couple of years, from vehicle mile traveled to carbon taxes to gas taxes to tolling to things that we probably haven't even imagined, or some sort of a hybrid. This is probably a good time to take a look at that and really figure out what are the investments we need to make, where do we need to make that, and how do we do that? Because this is, as I see it, this is our opportunity. And as I said, it helps put people back to work. It helps to build our trade. We're going to have to build our way out of it. And that, to me, is really the policy focus going forward from this point on.
If I might add on to Johan's comments, I think it brings into stark relief, at least for us as ports, the competitive pressures that we face. The majority of our customers do not live in Washington State. The majority of the cargo that is flowing through our gateway is either originating from or destined to someplace else outside of that state. In many ways, we've got this nickname of being the Port of Chicago because we are that gateway for imports coming in from Asia, headed to the American Midwest and the East Coast, and then vice versa. And when you think about that context, you realize that we do not have a monopoly on the business. Our customers have lots of alternatives in terms of where they want to go. And even before we got into the case of the current global pandemic, that competition was absolutely fierce with other ports in California, on the Gulf and East Coast, or up in Canada in particular. What the pandemic has done has reduced those cargo volumes, so the competition has become even more fierce. And in order for us to remain in the game, we're going to need to make sure that we've got the appropriate infrastructure to be able to handle that freight. Passenger traffic may be down, freight traffic is not, to Johan's point. And in fact, what we are finding is that the ocean carriers are needing to consolidate their business into ever larger vessels. It's a way for them to be able to consolidate their costs. Instead of having to operate 3 ships, you're able to operate 1, but to operate 1 much larger vessel, you need to have taller container cranes, you need to have stronger piers to be able to handle those heavier cranes, longer pier lengths, larger rail yards, bigger gate infrastructure to be able to handle Sherry's members' trucks as they come in. That is all going to require a financial investment. And the reason why that is critical for the Washington state economy is not only do you create a lot of jobs associated with trade and transportation, the people who work for our organizations, but you also are supporting Washington state manufacturers, Washington state growers. The reason why you can have a hay grower in Ellensburg export their product is because of the fact that we've got a bunch of imports coming in from Asia. Those containers get emptied out and no one wants to export air. It's better to put something in there. I think back to a conversation that we had 10 years ago during the Great Recession. One of our hay growers located in central Washington came to us and he said he could easily double his exports in the midst of the Great Recession, but he couldn't do it because he couldn't get enough containers and he couldn't get enough access to vessels because the imports had plummeted. And so I raise all of these issues to say it's going to be critical for Washington state to continue to make those investments in infrastructure. To Johan's point, you are able to get a double win out of that, not only because you're going to be creating construction jobs on the short-term basis, but you lay the foundation for long-term growth to be able to support jobs in our sectors, but also the ag and manufacturing sectors in Washington state.
Yes. Johan, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm just in strong agreement of everything that Sean just said. I think it was very well stated and very eloquent. I completely agree. It's inspired me, actually.
Gary, you had something you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, I'm in agreement with both my colleagues here, and of course Chris on the phone, I'm sure is in agreement as well. One of the observations that we made, and I appreciate Johan mentioning highway funding and the future of highway funding, because that is something that's paramount on our minds, obviously as the trucking industry and users of the highway. But one of the things that the pandemic conditions has brought, we're an industry that is all about highway capacity. And obviously in some areas there's not enough capacity, in other areas there's capacity plentiful. But one thing that we realized, and this might be something for the commission to consider, is capacity is created not just by building highway miles, but by changing the way we live and work. As I said, overnight, 40% of vehicles were off the roads, which created unlimited capacity for the trucking industry to move goods, critical goods that obviously were more critically needed at a critical time. So just something to consider. I don't know how much my members would agree with me, but I think that I think that's absolutely an important point to consider, and how do we maintain that?
And if I may add, looking at just one piece of infrastructure, bridges, how it affects all of us in large and small ways. The obvious example is the West Seattle Bridge and everything that's been going on with that, because trucks move across it all day, every day. It's right on top of Harbor Island. Our train tracks run right underneath it. All of that is critical to serving T5, which is being constructed right now. So that has a major impact on the whole region. To take that down to a more local level, I can think of a bridge in the city of Tukwila, the 42nd Avenue Bridge. The way that they rate bridges is on a 1 to 100 scale, with 100 being brand new, state of the art, and 1 being almost in danger of collapse. My understanding is that that bridge currently rates a 7. A 7. And again, that is a bridge that trucks move across all day. It goes through the community. It serves our intermodal yard in South Seattle. And so you have this thing where all of the modes are kind of coming together. We all depend on that bridge. And that bridge, you know, is really probably at the end of its life cycle. And I can just imagine, you know, many, many examples of that. That's just one type of infrastructure. There are other infrastructure, last mile connectors, things that we talk about at the FMCIB board in different places. So really glad that folks are talking about this right now, because there's such a need for it.
Well, I don't want to dominate this when you have other commissioners, but one thing I would encourage your industry sectors to very much be involved in is resiliency and emergency planning. You know, it's easy when you're a retired guy to sit back and go, gee, what did we do wrong? I've heard the word pandemic before in emergency management plans, but I don't think I ever understood what the magnitude of such a thing could happen. And also, being guilty as a planner that graduated from college in the 70s, we look back before we look to the future. But I don't know that we always catch the full drift, because when I was looking back, when I graduated from college, we had about 105 million people in the United States. We have 340 million today. And you got to keep a handle on what, and I understood from Econ 101 what exponential growth was, but putting the human factor into that and what it takes to serve that human factor, I'm not sure that we all catch that drift. So I think your kind of involvement with those planning agencies is critical. With that, any other commissioners have questions? They all fell asleep listening to me.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Batra. I do have a comment. Due to the pandemic COVID-19, we are going to be seeing a major change in the service industry, and they are going to be thinking very seriously of decentralizing, as opposed to these mega high-rise buildings where thousands of people get together and work in office, and they have to start looking at people working from homes and all the things that you guys discussed about it, you know, too. Are there any merits in decentralizing ports and terminals, as opposed to putting a lot of investment in 1 or 2 ports by making it deeper and bigger and cranes and all those things, as opposed to perhaps making commodity specific various ports, and by way of decentralizing it and building infrastructure that way? Are there any merits in that?
So let me take a first crack at this, and then Chris, I think I would welcome your thoughts on that. First thing, we're certainly having the same types of conversations that I think everybody is having about who in your workforce is essential for having to actually go into the building, right? And I think the lesson that we are learning is that there are a lot of us that can continue to do our jobs from wherever. And so much like what Sherry was talking about, the notion and the dream of telecommuting, I think we're going to see that take place as well. We don't need our finance people to have to necessarily be in the building. I don't necessarily need to be in the building. So you're going to see some of that reimagining take place. In terms of the terminals and the load centers, it will be interesting to see where that plays out. My imagination is that you will continue to see incentives for continued consolidation, because I think we have, in many aspects, more capacity out there. That is why you saw things like the ports of Tacoma and Seattle coming together to form the Northwest Seaport Alliance. So instead of competing with each other, we're going to come together in cooperation and partnership. That is why you see that a number of our terminals are, in fact, we are merging our terminals. They are creating larger load centers, but again, we are finding there's just not enough business to have, 8, 9, 10 different terminal operators competing against one another in the exact same gateway. And so I think you're beginning to see that get consolidated to a smaller number of terminals. We have seen that in the ocean carrier business. Even pre-COVID, we went from 2018 to 2019. We saw the number of ocean carriers participating in the Trans-Pacific market shrink by 1/3. And we also saw that the remaining ocean carriers consolidated into these alliances and partnerships, so that you had 3 of these mega alliances. Not unlike the partnership you might see in the airline industry, where you might book a flight with Alaska and end up on a later segment, being flipped onto an American airline jet or something like that. It was the same sort of thing taking place within the maritime system. I don't know if I necessarily imagine that going away. I think that COVID, in fact, continues to incentivize that consolidation. With that said, what we also recognize is that the health of Washington State is critically dependent on, yes, the Seaport Alliance, but all of our other sister ports within Washington State. And we know that the health of the Washington State economy is only better when we know Grace Harbor is doing well, Vancouver is doing well, Everett is doing well. We tend to specialize more in niches where we aren't going head to head. So I think you see some of that type of spread take place. But if you were to say, at least within the container business, I think you're going to see further consolidation. And Chris, I don't know if you've got additional thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would tend to agree. I think we're a little unique here, actually, in Washington, with the number of independent, publicly managed port districts that we have in the state, and they are working really well together, but have really developed niche markets. As Sean mentioned, I think one piece, we've got the Columbia River ports, which have traditionally been agricultural based entities, are doing a lot of project cargo and a lot of wind infrastructure to support the wind industry in the state. And it'll be interesting, I think, as we see, I think, more of that transition to quote unquote clean energy. What other opportunities do we see? Wind, solar. What about the state and its development of hydrogen, industry, and how does that sort of change the landscape? I think that those are sort of some of the things I think that will be interesting to watch. I think another piece I think is really better connecting the different modes, and I know it's been something we've been working on for a really long time, but as we see more of a transition to from us all going to the mall or the shopping center to get even our day-to-day food needs for sustenance, and having that delivered at our doorstep, that is going to change in a significant way how freight moves. And I think what companies that are in that space will look for their supply chains to be as resilient and nimble as they can be, and use the right mode for the right, really the right tool for the right product. And so the ways that we connect those things and where we connect those things, I think are going to become increasingly important. You know, right now we have the mall, which is where you go to get those things, and that's going to change in the very near future, if it already hasn't in a lot of places.
Well, great, thank you. Any other questions from the commissioners or staff? Whoever wants to ask a
Hi,
question.
Jerry. I have a question. Debbie Young, so this is a commissioner, this is a question for Sean. Towards the end of your presentation, you said it'd be important to recapture market share, and you touched briefly on in your comments just a few minutes ago about the increasingly fierce competition that's resulted from reduced cargo. But do you feel, as a result of COVID, that the Seattle and Tacoma ports have actually lost share to other ports or other transportation methods as a direct result?
We have seen, yes, we have seen, I don't know if I can point to COVID, but what I can say is we are specifically watching, we've seen a big downturn because of COVID. We have seen other ports that we compete with also see a downturn. The drop, however, in cargo volumes in Washington State is higher, though, than what we are seeing in those other gateways. So as a result, you know, we're seeing a reduction in our volumes. And what you're just seeing is it's an increasing competition. We've got to figure out ways to be able to move the cargo faster, and we've got to be able to figure out ways to move that cargo more cheaply. Because at the end of the day, the beneficial cargo owners, they are suffering economic pain like everyone else. And so as they are trying to figure out how to be able to stock their store shelf or what have you, you know, they're taking costs and speed into account. And if other gateways can move it quicker and cheaper, those other gateways are going to win out.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Going once?
Jerry, this is Rima. I have a question around supply chain logistics, and your guys' thought as we've witnessed in this pandemic. One of the companies that's done really good is Amazon, and it's because everybody's at home ordering everything now, and people that maybe weren't Amazon customers are now Amazon customers, and the likelihood of this going away is not very high. It may lessen over time, but what are your guys' thoughts on how we, in terms of investments into the future, how do we enable and accelerate the ability for just-on-time deliveries and this notion of getting to people's homes as opposed to distribution centers or stores, big box stores, as people start demanding that it come directly to them?
Is that directed to me?
Any one of
yeah, I mean, I think as Johan pointed out, freight volumes are still there. We were on a pretty good trend for increasing freight volumes for several years into the future in all modes of transportation. So, and I don't think that's changed. I think there's a short-term lag in freight, and obviously in the case of ports, we're dependent on global economics and other things. I think getting those deliveries to homes instead of I'm probably one of the case in point people. I don't even go to the mall anymore, and I've done that for a long time. I dread going to the mall, where I used to spend hours in the mall. So having a reliable, I think that's what Amazon does so well at is the reliability of the goods that are delivered. I think just consolidating those deliveries and ensuring that they're going to be at your doorstep when you arrive home, again, highway and road capacity. I think we've seen some things morphing and changing in the city of Seattle with the protest movement, and a few things that are a little concerning with roadways being morphed into other use facilities, which is perfectly fine. We're mimicking what other countries are doing and doing well, but at the same time, those things have an impact on freight movement, and which our expectation is that we have it on our doorstep when we want it, and all of these things kind of factor into potentially impacting our ability to do that.
And Rima, I think there's an infrastructure piece to the question, but there's also a land use piece to the question. I serve on the Seattle Freight Advisory Board, and we spend, I mean, hours and hours and hours, sometimes in every meeting, talking about designing roads so that 18-wheeler trucks are able to get through them, or delivery trucks are able to get through them, because we want to have livable communities, but part of being livable is being able to restock grocery stores. So even if you make everything bike ped friendly, you still have to be able to get large vehicles into these communities to be able to restock. You still need to be able to get delivery trucks through areas. The other thing too is particularly with the kind of growth that we've seen in Seattle, there's been this real kind of love affair with the bright, shiny object of condos and multi-story buildings and multi-use facilities. And what we found the last 3 months is that the resiliency in our communities really stays in the industrial areas, and the innovation in our communities, when there is a new way of delivering services, when there's a shift to more online purchasing, that happens in the industrial areas. Previous question, Chris and Sean did a great job of talking about this very rich port structure that we have in Washington State. We have 75 individual port districts in Washington, and they're all critical to the communities that they serve. Maintaining that, recognizing the incredible resource that we have with all of that, and really, not trying to block out or intrude onto the industrial parts of our cities, but really to celebrate them for what they are, which is centers of resiliency and innovation, because a lot of great ideas are being produced there, particularly as we're seeing this shift away from storefront retail sales to online sales. That's where a lot of innovation is going to happen, is in the industrial sectors.
And in fact, what I would note is that the basis of your question still requires a supply chain that doesn't necessarily look all that dramatically different from the status quo. The difference is that instead of Sherry or me or Johan driving to the mall, there is a new mall. It's just called the Warehouse Distribution Center down the street from me, and instead of me driving to them, they're going to drive to me. But you still need, at the end of the day, the roadways to be able to handle that freight. You still need the industrial lands to be able to site that facility. Whether that facility is supplying my local mall or me, you still need the distribution center facility, and you still need the marine ports to be able to bring that cargo in, because whether you are purchasing the widget at whether you're buying a pair of shoes at the Nike store or Amazon, that Nike shoe is still coming from Japan, right? And so you still need to be able to have that cargo to be able to handle that. And it certainly doesn't help, like I think to Johan's point, when you see encroachment on our industrial lands and encroachment on our marine terminals with non-compatible uses. Just at the end of the day, our economy absolutely depends on our railroads, on our trucks, on our ships, on our ports. They are not necessarily beautiful things to look at. I will concede this point. They may not always smell the best. We may be loud, we may be noisy. You don't want to live next to us, but you gotta have us in order for you to continue to have the lifestyles that we wish to have as a society. And so continuing to ensure that there are appropriate buffers between us, that you're not building the condo that Johan just referred to right next to, across the waterway from Husky Container Terminal, or you're building an arena, let's say right next to Terminal 46 in Seattle. I mean, that just is going to be a disaster for everybody in the end.
Well, great. Thank you, everybody. We filled all the time plus a minute or two. So Yeah, these are the kinds of conversations that really help us, though, when we're starting to look at updating plans and moving things forward. So really appreciate everybody's input, and we'll be talking again, I'm sure. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, our last agenda item today is what we do at the end of most meetings, which are reflections. Whoops, push the wrong button. There we go. And been kind of a whirlwind morning and a pretty full afternoon. So